Most women mellow with age, but not all. A grandma resents a new family member.
He didn't see this one coming.
A businesswoman cooks more than the books.
Her kingdom was being threatened.
And a divorcee tries to bury her past.
I didn't know what to do, so I just took him and I buried him in the herb garden.
These deadly women are old, but not wise. In 2004, in California, it's a special day for 22-year-old Leslie. She's marrying 25-year-old Alex Reyes. And she's expecting their baby. Alex is excited to be a father. But there's one guest who isn't happy.
If you look at the pictures of her, you never see her smiling.
The bride's 81-year-old grandmother, Jean Allen.
Now, please join us.
You can do much better than him.
She doesn't approve of this shotgun wedding.
You got the very strong feeling that there was nothing about Alex that she liked.
Jean never approved of Alex for her granddaughter. For apparently no good reason. Alex believed it was because he was Mexican.
But Grandma Jean can't take away Alex's joy at becoming a father.
So, I've decided I'm gonna be a cop.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Alex Reyes was a good man in training to be a police officer.
I mean, it's a steady income and I can look after all of us.
I think you look good in uniform.
Go. Get the bottle. I'll take care of this one.
He would brag about his son at work, show pictures on his cell phone of his baby and how much he wanted to spend time with him.
As the newlyweds dream of their future, the reality falls short.
Leslie, please stop!
I can't do this anymore!
What? Tell me, what do you want?
No, I don't know. I don't want you.
Clearly, it wasn't a happy union.
We're leaving.
No, he is my son. You are not taking him away.
It's my son too, and I can't.
It seems Grandma is right.
Leslie leaves her husband after only 6 months of marriage, takes her baby, and goes to live with her grandma, Jean.
Jean is not only happy to get her granddaughter away from Alex, she's determined to keep him away from the baby.
Oh, come on, cheer up. You're both better off without him.
She doesn't feel that he's a good father. She doesn't like who he is.
How do you know?
Trust me, I know.
Thanks, Ned.
You're welcome.
She did not want the father to have much to do with the child. She wanted to make sure that her granddaughter had custody.
The couple is heading for divorce. But during the separation, the women allow Alex to visit his son.
The most important part of his life was his baby boy. He was a devoted father.
Where is he? Hi, buddy. How are you? Look at you. Oh, you're so big. Oh, you're heavy now.
Oh my, I think somebody needs a little change.
I can go get a diaper.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to. You can change, little man. Come on.
Alex, being the devoted father that he was, wanted substantial custody.
There you go.
The custody question hangs in the air for both of them until the divorce is finalized.
His legs are Dave. His legs are Dave. Yeah. That's a boy. Sit up. That's my boy. All right. Whoop. Hey, there we go.
Get away from him, Alex. I saw what you did.
What are you talking about?
What's going on? I saw him. He's a pedophile.
What? How dare you?
Quite possibly the worst thing that someone could ever be called is a child molester.
You get out now.
What? No, Leslie.
Get out.
It's not uncommon in bitter custody disputes.
You can't believe this.
You heard her. Get out. Now.
It's not uncommon, but it is despicable.
This changes everything. With his reputation smeared, Alex has to fight to keep his son.
I saw what happened.
Can you tell me exactly what you saw?
I was standing outside the doorway. Oh, he didn't know I was there. They're so cunning. He was calling the little boy disgusting names. And then he removed his diaper.
It's hard to defend. The action is taken first and questions are asked later.
Did you witness this as well?
No.
It would have to be a parent's worst nightmare.
It's a very powerful card to play if you're in a custody battle.
What about the custody of your son?
Leslie wants full custody. He's a monster.
Child Protective Services did restrict Alex's visitation to 2 hours twice a week, supervised by one of their own employees.
Where's your supervisor?
The allegation also means Alex's dream of becoming a police officer is over.
If you want a career in law enforcement, there is no way that a substantiated claim like that would ever allow you to do so.
Hey, little guy.
It had to have been a hell for him.
You watch him every minute.
What am I gonna do? It's all lies. I can't believe they made this up about me. Are you prepared to sit a polygraph test? Of course.
Alex sought out professional people to examine him to conclude that he was not a child molester.
Are you ready to begin?
Yes.
Can you tell me your full name?
Alex Leo Reyes.
Have you ever touched your son in an inappropriate way?
No.
Alex sought out a sex offender professional psychologist who examined him and determined that he didn't have it in him and he was telling the truth.
The couple is heading to court, and Alex is set to win.
How did I do?
The lawyer had said that he had several experts on hand that were going to testify that Alex was a good parent.
All the tests are favorable. The polygraph and the analysis by the sex crime experts.
There was no case of molestation. There was no facts showing that Alex was anything but a caring father in this case.
But Jean is a law unto herself.
She was perfectly calm. She was resolved. She was a woman on a mission.
It started as a fairy tale, a love child, a wedding, and a promising career.
I'm gonna be a cop.
Seriously?
Until Granny steps in.
All right. Whoop.
Get away from him, Alex. I saw what you did.
What are you talking about?
She alleges the worst.
He's a monster.
Alex Reyes's world crashes down.
All lies. I can't believe they made this up about me.
Are you prepared to sit a polygraph test?
He's determined to reclaim his name and his son.
Are you ready to begin?
Yes.
Alex had the support of his entire family. So much so that they even went with him on his supervised visits to see the baby.
January 28, 2006. The maligned dad is asked to come early by his estranged wife, Leslie.
Hi.
Thanks for coming early.
Sure.
Leslie had asked Alex to come over to work on a stroller that had broken. So Alex got there a few minutes early.
Yeah. Yeah, there it is.
His parents are in the car waiting for him. They're waiting for the court-appointed observer to arrive.
Grandmother Jean Allen tried everything to keep Alex away from his son.
You know, when everyone finds the truth about what you've done, you're gonna owe me a huge apology.
Alex was rightfully indignant and told Jean and Leslie that he wanted a written apology from them for the allegations they had made.
You're gonna owe me an apology too.
And Jean didn't like that. He didn't see this one coming.
She only fired twice. She nailed him both times.
Alex's parents were waiting for their son to bring their grandson out so they could all spend a couple hours together. Instead, they watched their son be murdered.
Jean robs a baby of a father and parents of an innocent son.
Jean puts her gun down, goes inside.
Yeah, police.
Calls 911.
I just shot a pedophile.
And says, I've shot a pedophile.
So this was her way of reestablishing control. When she calls 911, she's basically saying to them, I did it, I'm here, I'm in control.
Ma'am, just stay where you are.
Jean thinks the murder will be justified.
I don't feel guilty, you know.
Who defends a pedophile? But authorities don't see it that way. They find there is nothing justifiable about this homicide.
Jean was very proud of what she did, saying in God's eyes, she was innocent. She was a good person.
In 2006, Jean is convicted of first-degree murder. She's sent to prison for 25 years to life. For some women,
she was the queen bee.
Secrets are more important.
Her kingdom was being threatened.
Than life itself.
She was not gonna let it go.
On the outskirts of Waco, Texas, in 2007, the Sturdivant family celebrates a true milestone: 40 years in business.
Joe Sturdivant owned a transmission business, and it was a family business that's ran since 1967.
Hey, Joe, take a look at this.
Big Joe, man's man. Stock car driver, involved in racing since the 1960s. You know, here's a guy who was a pure Texan.
It's a real family affair.
You boys ready for a break?
Honey, you read my mind.
Wife, 62-year-old Joyce, handles the accounts.
Joyce ran the office. She did all the business transactions and handled all the money, insurance claims, things like that.
Thanks, Mom.
Her son, Joe Jr., works by her husband's side.
Joyce had a son from her first marriage, and they all just were one big happy family running this business together.
You got 4 new customers tomorrow.
I'll be able to retire soon.
You can. I'm out.
Heart problems do convince Joe to hang up his tools. And he relaxes into a well-earned retirement. But not Joyce. She takes over the company.
She had about 6 or 7 guys and other people that depended on her for their livelihood, so they treated her like a queen.
After Joe retired, she was the queen bee.
It's always been a profitable business. But now, with Joyce in the driver's seat, they hit a rocky road.
She had not paid the taxes in quite a few years on the business, and I believe that was over $140,000 worth of taxes that was due.
Joyce isn't paying the tax man because she's spending the money on herself.
She was basically embezzling their own money.
You know, she's not driving around with gold chains and diamond rings or gambling or drinking it. Where is this money going?
She has an expensive, secret habit.
Joyce was addicted to hydrocodone. That's an opium derivative. Lots of people become addicted to it quickly. No wonder she ran the business into the ground.
The queen bee is so deep in debt, she's about to lose everything.
Back over, come out of retirement, and sent her home.
You don't need to worry about that. You just leave the books to me.
Yes, sir. Her kingdom was being threatened.
But in the summer of 2007, there's a far more dramatic threat. Joyce is attacked in the bathroom.
Joyce had told us that someone had broken in, hit her over the head, knocked her out, and someone had gone into their bedroom.
What the? You get out of
But Big Joe's no easy target.
He was surprised by Big Joe because Big Joe responded quickly to the attack and fought him off pretty well. And in the end, he just needed to get out of there, and so he fought him off by hitting him over the head with the pistol.
Big Joe suffers a severe head injury.
Looks like you put up a bit of a fight. Yeah, but not a winning one. Man.
No, I got hit too from behind.
She kept saying, there's a bump right here, there's a bump right here. And I work in the medical field, and I felt her head, and I didn't feel anything. And then the doctor came in and said, there's nothing, there's no bump.
You see the man? No. It was so dark. I couldn't see a thing.
Joyce and Joe can't describe their attacker. They have no known enemies. There is little for the police to go on.
The investigation into the home invasion case went along for a while and then just lost steam.
Joyce is strangely uninterested in finding her attackers.
I've never come across the scenario that we found in the start of the case. It was bizarre.
On the outskirts of Waco, Texas,
What the? You get out of
Big Joe Sturdivant suffers head injuries during a violent home invasion. And his attackers are still at large. But his wife, Joyce, is oddly unconcerned because she planned the whole thing.
Joyce was a little bit afraid of Joe finding out she had run his business into the ground.
Joyce is looking for new hirers.
It's Big Joe. He's beat me.
Joyce was complaining about Joe, and Joe beating her up, as far as we know, was unfounded.
Joe's life insurance can get her out of her financial hole,
I need your help.
but only if he meets an untimely accident.
And he says, I know some people who might get it done, but I can beat them up for you if you pay me. So about 3 o'clock in the morning, they drive over to Joyce's house.
Bedroom to the left. That's where he is, okay?
And Joyce, she's got everything ready. She's got the dogs locked up and the house open. She sits back, thinking, tonight's the night. They're gonna take care of business for me. And she's kind of in the bathroom, in the corner, and she's got her fingers in her ears. Like she's anticipating a loud noise, maybe the crack of a gun.
But Big Joe's self-defense saves his life.
It didn't play out like Joyce had originally planned for it. She clearly wanted him dead.
Joyce turns to Plan B, a trusted friend in the office who might know someone in the murder game.
Find some trustworthy guys.
They developed a relationship, and Joyce asked if she knew anyone that could help her get rid of her husband.
She eventually found 2 guys that said they would do it.
These are worth a lot more than $2,000.
And these 2 men wanted, of course, to be paid.
Joyce couldn't pay a hitman because she was in horrible debt. She thought her jewelry would be enough.
All right, I'll put it out there, see what bounces back.
What bounces back is robbery. The men simply take Jean's jewels and run.
These guys had no intention of killing Joe Sturtevant.
They seen an opportunity, and they're going for it. And you know what, Joyce? If you say anything, we're gonna turn you in.
But the Queen Bee doesn't give up easily.
She finally said, well, I'm just going to take matters into my own hands. If you want something done, you got to do it yourself.
In the early hours of October 8th, 2008, Joyce moves on to Plan C.
You don't normally think of murderers walking around in shower caps. It appears that Joyce was concerned about the blood splatter, trying to make sure she covered up everything.
Joyce got a .38 caliber pistol. We knew that they had a lot of guns around the house.
Big Joe is sound asleep. She could probably hear his nose whistle. She walks up. She kills him cold-bloodedly, just like that, for nothing. A man she has known for almost 50 years and been married to for 4 decades.
Finally, Joyce achieves her goal. Now, to get away with it.
Joyce knew she was going to be gone all day. That was her alibi, was that she was at work. She needed to make sure the body wouldn't start decomposing immediately, and she thought merely turning down the air conditioner and lighting a candle would do the trick.
She stages the scene, flips some tables over, pulls some drawers out, and kind of makes it look like someone was in there trying to rob the place, and maybe Joe woke up.
Joyce spends the day in the office, and no one suspects a thing.
She came back, went into the house, immediately called 911.
I need someone to come here right away.
Said, I think my husband has had a heart attack.
I think my husband's had a heart attack.
Big Joe had a history of heart trouble. But as the crime scene evidence indicated, that's not what happened to him.
Half his head's gone. It's very bloody.
The crime scene also did not match with a burglary because nothing was taken. It looks like the drawers were pulled out and things were tussled about a bit, but nothing was really taken.
And soon enough, her previous consorts start spilling to the police.
Mistake number one, Joyce approached way too many people about killing her husband. Mistake number two, all of them were untrustworthy.
In 2011, Joyce Sturdivant is convicted of attempted capital murder and first-degree murder. She is sentenced to 30 years in prison. Joyce began by stealing money. In the end, it was a life.
She ruined my family. She ruined our lives.
Joyce was a cold, calculating, selfish individual who thought only of herself. She is exactly where she needs to be, and that's in the penitentiary.
Get more Deadly Women online. Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/deadlywomen. The golden years of retirement.
She liked to be out and about.
Can be ripe for adventure.
She should have known that it was only a matter of time.
Betty? As long as you can handle the pace.
She took it a little too far.
In Midwest City, Oklahoma, Barbara Broadway is preparing for something she hasn't done in a long time.
Stop it.
A date.
Great. Oh, I'm too old to go on a date.
Trust me, he's a lovely guy, and he's actually older than you.
I'll get that.
Barbara got along with everyone.
Come on. She wanted to still get out and do things. Fool around with her friends somewhere.
Hi, how you going? Fanny, this is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
Hello.
Nearing her 60s, with her children all grown up, the divorcee isn't ready to be put on the shelf. In 2004, 70-year-old Benny Scott lights her fire.
Ooh, thank you.
And they both give love another try.
Benny had children from a previous marriage as well, so it was kind of a blended family.
I love gardening.
Oh, I'm no good in the garden.
Oh, I just love growing my own herbs.
I'd love to taste them sometime.
Well, I think that can be arranged.
Benny was one of those men who is dependent on women. He needed to have a woman in his life.
Barbara has her new man, but she doesn't want her new life to be in Oklahoma.
You've made me the happiest old man in the world.
Me too.
She wants to join her daughter in Florida.
He had a lot of friends, but they were all in Oklahoma.
I love you, but I miss my family.
She worked on him and worked on him.
I don't want to leave Oklahoma.
What about my needs?
He didn't want to move from Oklahoma, but Barbara did, so he moved with her.
By 2009, the couple relocates to Lake Alfred, Florida.
They were able to get a very nice house. The temperature never got cold, and you didn't have any of those Oklahoma dust storms. It was really a good environment.
Barbara is living the dream, but it comes at a price.
It's so humid.
Isn't it great?
Benny was getting up in his late 70s, and his health was not good at all.
I'm going in. Barbara!
Benny's heart had let him down. He had a heart attack,
My chest.
pacemaker, stents, and he was in congestive heart failure.
It's a blow for Barbara. Being nursemaid is not part of her Florida dream.
It's time for you to get up.
I don't want to get up. I'm tired.
You're fine. The doctor said so.
Barbara was 13 years younger than Benny, and her health was just fine.
You can't leave me here alone.
I can, and I will.
For months, Benny's health ebbs and flows. But Barbara is comforted by being close to her daughter for big occasions like Christmas.
Oh, thank you.
You two seem happy.
We are. Merry Christmas.
But for every good day comes the bad.
To say he was slowing down in life, getting towards the end of life, would be probably a good description.
Benny relies on Barbara more and more. Not just physically, emotionally.
Benny's emotional needs were far greater than his physical needs.
She was his emotional crutch. He was afraid his body would fail him and there would be no recourse if he was alone.
But Barbara is tired of playing nurse.
Benny's demands on Barbara crimped her style. She liked to be out and about. Benny wanted her on the sofa next to him. All the time.
Briskly.
Coffee, tea, or something?
Tea would be great, thanks.
She even has her family clean out Benny's belongings from their garage.
She was selling everything that belonged to Benny.
Can't throw these away. I would want these pictures, you know.
They discovered childhood photos and mementos of Benny's. And they thought, surely he's going to want this stuff. So they figured, okay, we'll call Benny's daughter in Oklahoma.
Look, we're in the storage locker and we're sorting through some stuff. Just don't know what to keep. Can I talk to Benny for a while?
When they called the daughter in Oklahoma, she said, he's not here. Dad is in Florida with Barbara.
In Florida, 2012.
You missed everyone in Oklahoma.
64-year-old Barbara Scott seems mighty confused about her husband's whereabouts.
I'll be fine. Well, Benny is in Oklahoma with his family.
She said, well, Benny went back to his family in Oklahoma, and I don't know if he ever wants to come back to Florida.
But at the same time, telling his family in Oklahoma,
Hello?
he's still in Florida, but unavailable.
No, I'm sorry. He can't come to the phone at the moment. He's got a throat problem.
She kept claiming that he had either laryngitis and could not talk on the phone to his children, or that he was ill or hospitalized.
Oh, he'll be fine. He's having surgery next month.
When Benny wasn't seen for 3 months, people got worried.
And it was only a matter of time before
Barbara says it's an act of nature. One morning in the shower, Benny falls and hits his head.
Benny?
Barbara admitted to her daughter, yes, Benny slipped and fell in the shower.
Benny?
Banged his head and it killed him.
Benny!
He didn't have any pulse, he wasn't breathing. I didn't know what to do. I panicked. There's a dead body in my shower. So I just took him and I buried him in the herb garden. And Benny was at rest in a bed of parsley, rosemary, and basil.
Mama, I think we
We gotta go to the police.
Her daughter convinces Barbara to tell the police everything. But when they exhume the body, they get a surprise.
What do they see? A bullet hole.
Benny?
Barbara immediately changes her story.
He committed suicide.
Benny!
I walked in, and he was collapsed on the floor of the shower.
She was overwhelmed. She was ashamed. It was like a dirty family secret for someone to commit suicide.
I was so beside myself with grief that I didn't know what to do, so I buried him in the backyard.
There are just a few problems.
He's absolutely never been depressed. He's never talked to suicide, anything like that. A couple years ago, Benny had his pacemaker put in. That's not the kind of person who commits suicide.
And the autopsy report shows Benny was shot in the back of the head.
It has been my experience that people committing suicide with a gun don't hold it to the back of their head.
It is physically impossible for Benny to hold a gun, a .22 caliber revolver, several inches from his head and fire the bullet. It was ruled a homicide.
Barbara is caught, a cold-blooded murderer. She executed her husband because he was slowing her down.
It's definitely a strange case. People that are in their golden years, you think usually it's right off into the sunset. In this one, it ends up buried underneath an herb garden.
In 2014, Barbara Scott is found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole.
She got rid of the problem in the only way she could think possible. It was selfish, it was regrettable, and there's no excuse for taking Benny's life.
These deadly women should have known better. Jean Allen allowed prejudice to destroy her.
It begins with a sound that never made it into the police report, a sound no one could ever quite agree on, a sound that some neighbors swore was a scream and others insisted was just the television bleeding through thin apartment walls. The kind of sound you dismiss because Florida nights are loud and restless and full of reasons not to look out the window, but that sound lingered anyway, hanging in the humid air of a small coastal town in the summer of 1981. The moment before everything fractured and a life quietly slipped into the category police hate the most, the kind they label in thick black marker and then push to the back of the shelf, a cold case waiting to happen. The apartment sat at the edge of a sun-faded complex near the highway, palm trees bent by years of salt wind, paint peeling in long white curls, the kind of place where people came and went without learning each other's names, where doors stayed shut and questions stayed unasked. And inside that apartment was a woman who had plans for the next morning, clothes laid out on a chair, coffee grounds already measured in the kitchen, a calendar with a date circled in red, a future that assumed continuity, that assumed she would wake up. When she didn't, it took hours before anyone noticed, then days before anyone understood, and weeks before the community began to whisper the words that would stick for decades: mysterious disappearance, possible homicide, unsolved cold case. Her car was still there, parked crookedly as if she had rushed inside for something small and urgent. Her purse sat on the counter. No note. No sign of a struggle obvious enough to calm the panic or focus the fear. Just absence, sudden and complete. Police arrived under a sky so bright it felt insulting, sunlight bouncing off windshields, radios crackling, officers walking through the apartment with that careful, detached curiosity that comes before dread sets in. They catalogued what they could, fingerprints smudged by time and heat, fibers too common to mean anything, a half-empty glass in the sink, a door that showed no forced entry. Someone had been let in, or already inside. Someone had known her, or known how to look harmless. That uncertainty lodged itself deep and refused to move. The town reacted the way small towns do, with a surge of fear followed by exhaustion. People locked their doors earlier. Parents walked their children to the bus stop. Local papers ran bold headlines for a week, then smaller ones, then nothing at all. Tips poured in at first, frantic and contradictory. A man seen near the complex, a car idling too long, a stranger with the wrong look, the wrong posture, the wrong timing. Each lead dissolved under scrutiny, each witness certain at first, then hesitant, then embarrassed. The investigation slowed, then stalled, then quietly slipped into archival boxes labeled 1981, unsolved. Detectives changed. Captains retired. Evidence sat in sealed bags as technology leapt forward without it. The woman's name became shorthand, a reference point, a cautionary tale. Don't walk alone, people would say. Remember what happened back in 81. But remembering was vague. The details blurred. The fear dulled. Only one thing stayed sharp, the not knowing. Years passed, then decades. Florida changed around the case, highways widened, condos rose where scrubland used to be. New families moved in with no idea that their morning jog route traced the edges of an old crime scene. The case file gathered dust, literally and metaphorically, until it became what investigators call a cold case, not because the pain cooled, but because the trail did. And yet, cold cases have a way of breathing when you least expect it. A box reopened for inventory. A new detective curious enough to read past the first few pages. A lab technician noticing something once dismissed as background noise. In this case, it was a piece of evidence so ordinary it had been invisible, preserved without intention, waiting for a time when science could ask it better questions. But in 1981, none of that was visible. All anyone could see was a town trying to move on, and a family who couldn't. They searched on their own, posted flyers long after the ink faded, called police stations just to hear a human voice confirm that the case still existed. Every ring of the phone carried hope and dread in equal measure. Every rumor reopened the wound. Investigators revisited the apartment, mentally if not physically, replaying the timeline. The last confirmed sighting. The call she never returned. The neighbor who thought they heard something, but didn't check. The locked door that told two opposite stories at once. They asked themselves the same questions over and over, the kind that echo at night. Who was the last person to see her alive? Who knew her routine? Who benefited from her absence? Who got away with something because the moment passed too quickly? There were suspects, of course. There always are. A former partner with a temper and an alibi just solid enough to raise suspicion. A co-worker who knew too much about her schedule. A drifter questioned and released, his name misspelled in the report. None of them stuck. None of them crossed the line from interesting to chargeable. Evidence was circumstantial, memories unreliable, and the clock kept ticking. By the late 80s, the case was officially cold. By the 90s, it was history. By the early 2000s, it was a footnote. But cold cases don't end just because people stop talking about them. They end when something breaks, when a thread is pulled hard enough to unravel what time tried to preserve. For this case, the break didn't come with sirens or headlines. It came quietly in a lab, under fluorescent lights, when a technician ran old evidence through new systems, when numbers appeared on a screen that hadn't existed in 1981, when a pattern emerged that didn't care how much time had passed. DNA doesn't forget. It waits. The result didn't make sense at first. The name attached to it wasn't on any suspect list. It belonged to someone ordinary, someone who had lived nearby, worked nearby, faded into the background of the town's memory. Someone no one had looked at twice. That's what made it terrifying. Detectives went back to old photos, old addresses, old employment records. The pieces began to align in a way that felt both thrilling and sickening. Missed connections. Overlooked proximity. A man who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, aging quietly while a family aged in grief. When police finally knocked on his door decades later, the shock rippled outward. For the family, it was like time collapsing in on itself, 1981 crashing into the present with brutal force. For the community, it was disbelief, the realization that the monster in the story wasn't a stranger passing through, but someone woven into the everyday fabric of their lives. But this is only the beginning of the end, the moment when a cold case starts to thaw, when answers arrive carrying more questions, when closure reveals its sharp edges. Because identifying a killer doesn't undo the years lost, and it doesn't explain everything, and it doesn't erase the feeling that something was missed when it mattered most. As the investigation reopened, every old assumption came under scrutiny. Every decision made in the heat of 1981 was reevaluated through the cold clarity of hindsight. The case was no longer dormant. It was alive again, pulsing with new energy and old ghosts, dragging the past into the present and refusing to let anyone look away. And somewhere in Florida, under a sky that looked no different than it did 40 years earlier, a family prepared to hear details they had waited a lifetime to know, details that would change the story forever, even as the echo of that long-ago night lingered, reminding everyone that some crimes never really end, they just wait. The name on the report didn't scream danger, didn't carry weight, didn't arrive with a criminal history thick enough to satisfy anyone's hunger for narrative justice. It was just a name, plain and unremarkable, the kind you'd skim past in a directory, and that was the first problem. Because monsters are supposed to announce themselves, they're supposed to leave marks, but this one had lived inside the margins, close enough to touch the case without ever triggering alarm bells. Detectives pulled everything they could find, tax records, utility bills, employment files yellowed at the edges, and slowly a map formed, not of motive yet, but of proximity, the quiet geometry of a life that intersected with the victim's world more times than coincidence should allow. He worked less than 2 miles from her apartment. He shopped at the same grocery store. He had been questioned once, briefly, in passing, his name logged incorrectly, his statement summarized instead of transcribed, and then he vanished from the paperwork, not because he fled, but because no one chased. In 1981, investigators had been looking for something obvious, a jealous lover, a violent drifter, a break-in gone wrong. What they hadn't been looking for was familiarity without drama, someone who knew the rhythms of the complex, who could knock without raising suspicion, who could stand in a doorway and feel ordinary enough to be trusted. That kind of threat doesn't fit cleanly into a police bulletin. As the reopened investigation deepened, old witnesses were contacted, voices pulled from decades of silence, memories cracked open like sealed rooms. Some recalled a man they'd seen around often, too often to be a stranger, too rarely to be a friend. Others remembered nothing at all, which was almost worse. Time had eroded certainty, and detectives had to navigate the thin line between what was forgotten and what was rewritten by years of speculation. The suspect's life, examined in retrospect, showed fractures no one had noticed at the time. Job changes without explanation. A sudden move across town not long after the disappearance. Relationships that ended abruptly. Nothing illegal. Nothing provable. Just patterns that only gained meaning once the crime was given a face. When investigators brought him in for questioning, he was older, grayer, slower in his movements, but his eyes sharpened at the mention of 1981. The room felt heavy, the kind of airless tension that builds when both sides understand the stakes but pretend otherwise. He denied knowing her well. He denied being at the apartment that night. He denied everything that could be denied safely. But denial isn't proof, and proof was what this case had starved for. They laid the science on the table, methodically. The DNA profile recovered from evidence no one in 1981 knew how to read. A signature preserved by chance and patience. A biological echo that didn't care about excuses or fading memories. The match was strong. Overwhelming even. The kind of statistical certainty that leaves no room for coincidence. The suspect stared at the numbers longer than necessary, longer than comfort allowed, and something shifted in his posture, subtle but unmistakable. Still, there was no confession. Just silence, broken by rehearsed explanations and carefully chosen words. His attorney spoke for him. The interview ended. Outside the room, detectives felt the strange mix of triumph and frustration that only cold cases can deliver, the knowledge that they were closer than ever, and the fear that closer might still not be enough. News traveled fast. Faster than the investigators would have liked. The community reacted with a collective intake of breath, shock layered on top of old fear. People looked at their neighbors differently. They replayed memories they didn't realize they had kept. The idea that the answer had been nearby all along was unsettling. A reminder that danger doesn't always come from outside. Sometimes it's already parked in the driveway. For the family, the revelation landed like an earthquake. A name, a face, a possibility that the endless questions might finally collapse into something solid. But alongside relief came anger, sharp and immediate, directed not just at the man now under suspicion, but at the years that had been lost, the opportunities missed, the moments when a different decision might have changed everything. Prosecutors faced a difficult calculus. The evidence was powerful, but time is a defense all its own. Witnesses were unreliable. Physical scenes no longer existed. Memories had decayed. The case had to be rebuilt almost from scratch, brick by brick, with the burden of proving not just what happened, but when and how, and by whom, beyond a reasonable doubt. They reconstructed the night piece by piece, phone records, work schedules, traffic patterns, weather reports, anything that could anchor the story in verifiable fact. The suspects' movements were traced as best they could be, gaps highlighted, assumptions challenged. Every detail mattered now, because the margin for error was razor thin. Defense attorneys attacked the process, questioned the handling of evidence, suggested contamination, coincidence, alternative explanations. They leaned hard on the absence of a body, the lack of eyewitnesses, the decades-long delay. They painted a picture of a system desperate for closure, willing to bend interpretation to fit a narrative. It was effective. Doubt crept in where certainty had seemed inevitable. Behind the scenes, detectives felt the weight of the years pressing down. This case wasn't just about one crime anymore. It was about accountability, about proving that time doesn't erase responsibility, that justice can still reach across decades and tap someone on the shoulder. But it was also about acknowledging that some answers come too late to feel like victory. As court dates loomed, the suspect remained free, living his life under a cloud that followed him everywhere. Media trucks parked outside his home. Old acquaintances cut contact. Strangers recognized his face. He became, overnight, the embodiment of a town's unresolved trauma, guilty in the court of public opinion, and proven in the eyes of the law. The family sat through hearings with clenched hands and measured breaths, listening to lawyers argue over technicalities that felt obscene in the face of loss. Every delay reopened wounds. Every procedural setback felt like another disappearance, another vanishing of the truth just when it seemed close enough to touch. And yet, something had changed permanently. The case was no longer a ghost. It had shape. It had direction. The silence that had dominated for decades was broken, replaced by a low, constant hum of anticipation and dread. Even if the outcome remained uncertain, the narrative had shifted. The story now had a center of gravity. Late at night, detectives reviewed files alone, the glow of desk lamps reflecting off photos taken long before they joined the force. They wondered what the victim would have thought, knowing her life would become a question mark for so long, knowing the answer would arrive only after so much time had passed that it could never truly repair what was broken. Florida nights are still loud. Television still hum through thin walls. People still dismiss sounds because it's easier than confronting what they might mean. But somewhere beneath that noise, the echo of 1981 persists, a reminder that some moments don't end when the sun comes up, they stretch forward, waiting for the day when the past finally demands to be heard again. By the time the trial strategy began to take shape, the case had already split the town down invisible fault lines, the kind that don't show up on maps but determine who talks to whom at the grocery store, who believes the science, who believes the silence, who thinks 40 years is too long for the truth to matter anymore. The phrase Florida 1981 cold case started appearing again in headlines, paired now with words like breakthrough and identified, but always followed by a question mark that refused to go away. Investigators knew they were fighting more than a defense team. They were fighting time itself. Every piece of evidence had to be contextualized for a jury that hadn't been alive when the crime happened, a jury raised on instant answers and high-definition certainty. They had to explain why fingerprints weren't conclusive, why early interviews were thin, why procedures that look careless now were considered routine then. They had to translate the past without letting it excuse failure. They returned again to the apartment complex, not physically, but in models and diagrams, recreations built from memory and old photographs. They traced the path from the parking lot to the front door, the angles of sight from neighboring units, the way sound traveled through the building at night. They wanted to show how someone could enter without forcing anything, how a familiar face could dissolve the instinct to resist, how violence doesn't always announce itself with chaos. The absence of a body loomed over everything like a permanent shadow. Defense attorneys leaned into it relentlessly. No remains, no cause of death, no certainty she was dead at all. They floated alternative narratives, voluntary disappearance, secret escape, a new life somewhere else. Each theory strained credulity, but doubt doesn't need to be believable, it just needs to be possible. The prosecution countered with patterns. People don't leave behind their money, their car, their personal effects, their families, and vanish cleanly. They don't stop existing without leaving a trace. They argued that absence itself can be evidence, that the sudden erasure of a life speaks loudly when examined honestly. It was a difficult argument, one that required jurors to accept a conclusion without the physical finality they were used to seeing. As hearings dragged on, more details from the suspect's past surfaced, small incidents that hadn't mattered on their own but now clustered into something darker. A restraining order filed years later by a different woman, quietly settled and forgotten. Co-workers who described him as controlling, quick to anger when challenged. None of it proved murder. All of it suggested capacity. The suspect maintained his innocence with a calm that unsettled some and reassured others. He spoke softly when he spoke at all, avoided eye contact with cameras, leaned heavily on the passage of time. He said memories fade. He said mistakes happen. He said the system was trying to pin an old crime on an old man because it needed an ending. Outside the courthouse, reporters repeated the same phrases over and over: shocking development, decades-old mystery, cold case revived. Each repetition sanded the edges off the tragedy, turning it into consumable drama. For the family, it was unbearable. Their grief had never been episodic. It hadn't waited for headlines. It had lived with them daily, quietly, long after public interest disappeared. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated risk. A trial could end in acquittal, sealing the case forever, turning the identified suspect into a symbol of overreach. No trial meant no formal reckoning, no public accounting, just a conclusion reached on paper but never tested in open court. There was no option that didn't feel like a loss. The detectives who had reopened the case felt the pressure intensely. They believed in the science. They believed in the narrative they had reconstructed. But belief isn't admissible. They revisited every decision, every assumption, looking for weaknesses. They imagined the cross-examinations, the skepticism, the moment when certainty might fracture under scrutiny. As months passed, the suspect's health became a factor, another clock ticking down. The possibility that he might die before a verdict added urgency and dread in equal measure. Justice delayed is not just justice denied, it's justice that risks evaporating altogether, leaving nothing but speculation in its wake. Community meetings were held. Old residents spoke up. Some apologized for not paying attention back then. Others defended their past silence, saying fear makes people small. Younger residents listened, unsettled by the realization that their town's calm exterior rested on unresolved violence. The case became a mirror, reflecting not just one crime, but collective choices. In private moments, family members wrestled with conflicting emotions. Relief that someone was finally being held accountable. Rage that it had taken so long. Guilt for feeling anything resembling closure when so much had been lost. They revisited memories, birthdays missed, holidays marked by absence, lives shaped by a question that never stopped asking itself. The prosecution made its decision. They would move forward. The announcement landed with a thud, heavy and irreversible. Charges were filed. The suspect was formally named. The words "killer identified" appeared in bold type, though no verdict had been reached. Language ran ahead of law, as it often does. Pre-trial motions flooded the docket. Evidence was challenged. Expert witnesses were vetted. The DNA analysis was scrutinized down to the smallest procedural detail. Chain of custody became a battleground. Every hand that had touched the evidence, every hour it had been stored, every protocol that had changed since 1981 was examined for cracks. Through it all, the central mystery remained stark and unchanged. What happened inside that apartment on that night? How did a routine evening turn into a disappearance that swallowed for decades? The courtroom debates circled these questions without fully entering them, constrained by rules and relevance. As opening statements approached, tension thickened. The family sat together, a quiet cluster of resolve and exhaustion. The suspect sat alone, flanked by counsel, his face a study in restraint. The jury filed in, unaware that they were about to inherit a story older than many of them, a story that had waited patiently for their attention. And outside, Florida went on as it always had. The sun rose. Traffic moved. Life continued. But beneath that normalcy, the weight of 1981 pressed upward, demanding recognition, demanding judgment. The cold case was no longer cold. It was burning, and everyone close enough could feel the heat, even as they wondered whether it would finally illuminate the truth or simply leave more scars in its wake. The courtroom felt smaller once the trial began, walls closing in as if the past itself had taken a seat among the spectators, listening closely, waiting to see how it would be spoken aloud after all these years. Opening statements cut through the quiet like blades, the prosecution painting a picture of patience and inevitability, a man who waited for opportunity, who understood routines, who blended into the background until the moment he stepped forward and erased a life. While the defense leaned hard into uncertainty, into the gaps left by time, into the idea that suspicion hardens into assumption when people are desperate for an ending. Jurors were asked to imagine a Florida night in 1981 without the filters of modern technology. No cameras watching every angle, no digital trails, just darkness, proximity, and trust. Witnesses took the stand, some with voices steady, others trembling under the weight of memory. Neighbors described the way sound carried through the complex, how walls amplified ordinary noises into something ambiguous, how no one could say with confidence what they heard, only that something felt wrong in retrospect. Detectives explained the early investigation, the decisions made quickly and without malice, the leads followed, the ones abandoned. They admitted mistakes, procedures that would never pass today's standards. The defense seized on every admission, framing them not as human error, but as fatal flaws, cracks wide enough to let reasonable doubt pour through unchecked. Then the science arrived, sterile and uncompromising. Experts spoke in measured tones about DNA profiles, probability ratios so high they bordered on certainty, about how evidence preserved by chance had survived heat, humidity, and neglect. They explained how the sample tied the suspect to the apartment, to the night in question, to a moment he insisted never happened. The jurors leaned forward. Numbers don't lie, but numbers also don't tell stories on their own. Cross-examination was ruthless. Could contamination have occurred? Were protocols followed consistently across decades? Could the sample have been transferred innocently, through shared spaces, shared objects, shared air? The experts answered calmly, repeatedly, insisting the science held. The defense nodded, thanked them, and planted seeds of doubt anyway. The absence of the victim was a constant presence. Her photograph sat quietly on a table, eyes frozen in a moment before everything went dark. Friends and family testified about who she was, what she planned, what she left behind. They spoke of routines interrupted, of phone calls unanswered, of a life that didn't drift away but stopped abruptly. The defense objected often, wary of emotion tipping the scales. The judge sustained some, overruled others. Grief filtered through regardless. When the suspect took the stand, the room tightened. He spoke of memory loss, of ordinary days that blurred together, of a life lived without incident. He denied violence. He denied intent. He denied presence. He said he had nothing to hide, only too many years between then and now to defend himself properly. His voice was steady, practiced, almost gentle. Some jurors believed him. Others watched for cracks that never quite appeared. Prosecutors pressed him on timelines, on proximity, on inconsistencies so small they might have been meaningless in another context. Why did his account of that night shift subtly from one telling to the next? Why did he move shortly after the disappearance? Why had he reacted so strongly when contacted decades later? He answered carefully, blaming stress, coincidence, bad memory. The answers hovered, unsatisfying but not implausible. As the trial wore on, fatigue set in. Jurors struggled to hold decades of information in their minds at once. The story sprawled, resisted compression. This was not a clean case. It was jagged, compromised by time, burdened with expectation. Every day ended with uncertainty carried out of the courtroom and into the night. Closing arguments arrived heavy with implication. The prosecution urged the jury to look at the totality, the convergence of evidence, the improbability of coincidence. They argued that time had delayed justice, not destroyed it, that the truth had waited patiently and now demanded recognition. The defense responded with a warning that convicting on an old case sets a dangerous precedent, that doubt grows naturally when memories fade and evidence ages, that certainty manufactured too late is not certainty at all. The jury deliberated behind closed doors, voices rising and falling, grappling with questions no one else could answer for them now. Days passed. The family waited. The suspect waited. The town held its breath, reliving 1981 in fragments and arguments. When the verdict finally came, it didn't feel like an ending. It never does. It felt like a punctuation mark placed too far from the sentence it was meant to complete. Some felt relief. Others felt unease. The word justice was spoken, but quietly, cautiously, as if afraid it might not hold. Outside the courthouse, microphones clustered again, searching for reactions, for sound bites that could compress 40 years into something digestible. The family spoke of closure and pain in the same breath. The defense vowed appeals. The suspect was led away, his face unreadable, a man now permanently fused to a crime that had defined an era. That night, Florida settled into its familiar rhythms. Lights flickered on. Televisions murmured. Doors locked. Somewhere, a sound carried through thin walls and was dismissed as it always had been. But beneath that routine, something shifted. The cold case was no longer suspended in question marks alone. It had a verdict, an answer of sorts, imperfect and heavy. Yet even as the legal chapter closed, the story refused to rest. Doubts lingered. Arguments continued. People asked whether the truth had finally been reached or simply declared. The past, once reopened, doesn't seal itself easily. It leaks into the present, into conversations, into conscience. And so the case remained what it had always been at its core. A reminder that time changes everything except the moment when a life is taken, that some nights never really end, and that the echo of 1981 would continue to move through this place long after the courtroom emptied, whispering questions that no verdict could ever fully silence. In the weeks after the verdict, silence returned in a different form, heavier now, more deliberate, the kind that settles after something irreversible has been said out loud. The courthouse emptied, the cameras moved on, but the case did not dissolve back into history the way some had expected. Instead, it lingered, suspended between resolution and doubt, between legal finality and emotional unrest. Appeals were filed almost immediately. Pages of legal language questioned procedures, challenged interpretations, dissected jury instructions word by word. The defense argued that science had been elevated to certainty without acknowledging its limits, that the passage of time had warped context beyond repair. Prosecutors responded with confidence, insisting the evidence had spoken clearly enough, even across 4 decades. The battle shifted from courtroom drama to appellate briefs, quieter but no less intense. For the family, the verdict brought a strange kind of vertigo. They had imagined this moment for years, rehearsed it in their minds, believing it would feel definitive, that something inside them would finally settle. Instead, emotions collided. Relief existed, yes, but so did grief sharpened anew, grief that now had nowhere left to go. Justice did not return birthdays or rewrite empty chairs at holiday tables. It simply confirmed that the waiting was over. They revisited the past differently now, not as an open question, but as a closed file with jagged edges. They wondered what might have happened if the right name had been written down correctly in 1981, if the right question had been asked, if fear hadn't silenced witnesses, if technology had arrived sooner. Each hypothetical was a door that led nowhere, but once noticed, impossible to ignore. The town remained divided. Some accepted the verdict without hesitation, grateful for closure, eager to believe the system had finally worked. Others spoke in hushed tones, uncomfortable with the idea that a man could be condemned so long after the fact, uneasy with a conviction built on absence as much as presence. Online forums and late-night conversations revived the case again, parsing transcripts, speculating about motives, arguing over probabilities. The victim's apartment complex still stood, renovated now, repainted in brighter colors, marketed as modern living with no mention of its past. New tenants moved in unaware, or aware but unconcerned, the way people often are with inherited history. Yet some longtime residents avoided walking past her old unit, as if the walls themselves remembered more than they let on. Detectives who had worked the reopened case tried to move on, but found themselves drawn back to it repeatedly. They replayed testimony in their heads, second-guessed strategies, wondered if anything had been overlooked even now. Cold cases have a way of embedding themselves deeply, blurring the line between professional pursuit and personal reckoning. The suspect, now a convicted man, adjusted to a new identity defined entirely by the crime. In prison, he maintained his innocence, telling anyone who would listen that time had betrayed him, that memory had failed everyone involved. Some believed him. Others dismissed his claims as the last refuge of guilt. His appeals crawled through the system, each decision watched closely, each denial reinforcing finality. As months turned into a year, the case faded from headlines but not from memory. True crime podcasts revisited it, documentaries reframed it, each retelling emphasizing different details, different interpretations. The story evolved, as stories always do, shaped by whoever held the microphone. Facts blurred with narrative. Certainty softened at the edges. What remained constant was the image of a woman who had walked into her apartment one ordinary evening and never walked out again. Her face, preserved in photographs, became a symbol not just of loss, but of unanswered questions that survived even conviction. What exactly happened in those final moments? Was it planned or impulsive? Did she recognize the danger too late, or not at all? These answers were buried deeper than any verdict could reach. The legal system moved forward, satisfied that it had done what it could with what remained. But communities don't process trauma the way courts process cases. Healing does not follow procedure. It meanders, stalls, loops back on itself. Some residents felt safer knowing a name had been attached to the crime. Others felt more vulnerable, aware now that the threat had once been familiar, ordinary, unnoticed. Late at night, when the town quieted, the old questions resurfaced, the ones no appeal could erase. Could this have been prevented? Was justice delayed, justice denied? Did the truth emerge, or was it reconstructed just enough to stand? The Florida air carried on as it always had, thick and restless, indifferent to human conclusions. Time continued its work, smoothing some edges, sharpening others. New crimes demanded attention. New cold cases were born. But this one remained, fixed in the collective consciousness, no longer entirely unsolved, never entirely resolved. A case that began with a sound no one could agree on, and ended with a verdict that not everyone accepted. A reminder that even when a cold case ends on paper, its shadow can stretch on indefinitely. And somewhere between certainty and doubt, between justice and regret, the echo of 1981 persisted, quiet but insistent, asking the same question it always had, not whether a verdict was reached, but whether the truth had truly been heard. Time did what it always does after a verdict. It moved forward without waiting for consensus, carrying the case into a strange afterlife where facts were settled but meaning was not. The appeal process churned on in the background like distant machinery, slow and impersonal, while the human consequences played out in real time, in living rooms and offices and quiet moments when the mind wandered back to 1981 without permission. The family tried to rebuild routines that had never fully formed in the first place. Some returned to jobs they had held for years, others retired, claiming exhaustion when the truth was more complicated. Their identities had been shaped by absence for so long that presence felt unfamiliar. They spoke about the victim in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves only after the words were already out, a small rebellion against the finality everyone else seemed eager to impose. They visited the ocean often, standing at the shoreline where sound becomes constant, where waves erase their own tracks over and over again. It was the closest thing to peace they could find, a place where repetition didn't feel like stagnation but survival. There the case felt smaller, though never gone. The detectives watched from a distance as the narrative escaped their control. Books were proposed. Scripts were optioned. Commentators dissected their work with the confidence of hindsight. Some praised the persistence it took to resurrect a dead case. Others criticized the risk of conviction without a body. Both sides spoke as if certainty were a commodity, something that could be purchased with enough analysis. Inside police departments, the case became a reference point, a lesson used in training rooms and late-night conversations. Preserve everything. Write everything down. Assume technology will catch up. Assume time will judge you. Young officers listened, half impressed, half uneasy, realizing that the decisions they made on ordinary nights might someday be reopened under unforgiving light. The convicted man's appeals reached their first decisions, measured and clinical. Motions denied. Rulings upheld. Each document reinforced the state's confidence in its process. Each one also deepened the divide between those who saw perseverance and those who saw persistence mistaken for proof. In prison interviews, the man spoke less. When he did, his words were flatter, drained of the urgency they once carried. He said time had already taken everything else. He could wait. The town continued to change. New businesses opened. Old landmarks disappeared. A generation grew up knowing the case only as a story, something adults argued about with lowered voices. For them, 1981 was abstract, a date without texture. The danger of forgetting was no longer active fear, but apathy. Yet every so often, something would pull the case back into focus. A documentary trailer. A podcast episode trending unexpectedly. An anniversary article resurfacing photos long archived. Each resurgence reopened debate, reactivated old wounds. Closure, it turned out, was not a permanent state, but a temporary alignment of attention and belief. One former juror spoke years later, anonymously, admitting uncertainty had followed them home and never left. They described lying awake, replaying testimony, wondering if doubt had been interpreted correctly, if probability had been mistaken for fact. They said the responsibility didn't end with the verdict, it simply became quieter. The absence of physical remains remained the case's deepest scar. Without them, imagination filled the gaps relentlessly. Theories multiplied. Some were lurid, others restrained. None could be confirmed. The truth, if fully known by anyone, stayed locked behind time and memory, inaccessible now to law, science, or storytelling. Occasionally, tips still came in. People claiming to know something. People remembering something new. Most were late, irrelevant, or provably false. But each one forced a brief pause, a reconsideration, a reminder that certainty is fragile, always subject to interruption. The apartment complex changed owners again. Renovations erased more traces. Walls were knocked down, layouts altered. The physical space that had anchored the crime became unrecognizable. Whatever happened there was now preserved only in photographs and testimony, a crime scene without a scene. At night, those closest to the case found themselves returning to the same unanswered questions, not out of doubt, but out of habit. Habits formed over decades do not disappear with paperwork. They linger, shaping thought, shaping silence. The Florida heat pressed on as it always had, indifferent, oppressive, relentless. It was the same heat that had once accelerated decay, complicated timelines, blurred early evidence. It was the same heat witnesses remembered, the same air the victim had breathed on her last day. In that sense, nothing had changed at all. The case no longer belonged to the courts. It belonged to memory, to interpretation, to the uneasy space where justice and truth overlap but never fully merge. It existed now as a warning and a question, as proof of persistence and evidence of limitation. And as years continued to layer themselves on top of 1981, the cold case that had finally been given an ending remained suspended in collective thought, not frozen, not resolved, but quietly active, reminding anyone willing to listen that some answers arrived too late to heal, and some stories, once opened, never truly close. Years after the conviction, the case slipped into a quieter phase, no longer dominating headlines but never fully receding, like a low-frequency hum you only notice when everything else goes still. It lived on in footnotes and references, in the way investigators mentioned it when talking about persistence, in the way skeptics mentioned it when talking about the danger of certainty born too late. The story hardened into something symbolic, less about one night in 1981, and more about what time does to truth. New detectives, ones who hadn't been born when the victim disappeared, requested the files out of curiosity. They flipped through photographs and transcripts with fresh eyes, unburdened by the emotional weight of the original search. Some felt reassured by the coherence of the final theory. Others felt uneasy, noticing how much of the narrative relied on interpretation layered onto absence. Both reactions existed side by side, unresolved. The family marked anniversaries differently now. They no longer waited for calls that would never come, but the date still pressed on them with quiet insistence. They visited the same places, told the same stories, but something had shifted. The pain was no longer sharpened by anticipation. It was dulled by permanence. Grief, once active and searching, had become static, a condition rather than a response. The victim's name appeared occasionally in legislative discussions, invoked in arguments for better evidence preservation, for funding cold case units, for expanding DNA databases. Her life and disappearance became a reference point, a justification. In this way, she continued to exist within systems that had once failed her, reshaping them incrementally, indirectly. The convicted man aged further in custody, health declining, appeals narrowing. His world contracted to routines and regulations. In letters, he wrote less about innocence and more about time, about how memory betrays everyone eventually, about how the past becomes a story you tell yourself until you're not sure whether you're remembering or inventing. Some read this as manipulation. Others read it as resignation. Outside, the community moved on in visible ways and stayed stuck in invisible ones. New residents learned about the case the way people learn about old storms, with curiosity but no personal fear. Longtime residents carried it differently, as a lesson learned too late, a reminder that normalcy can coexist with violence unnoticed. Every so often, a former witness would die, their memories going with them. Each death quietly closed another door that could never be reopened. The case, once defined by too many unknowns, was now defined by the impossibility of knowing more. This was its final shape. Academics cited it in papers about delayed justice. Legal scholars debated it in classrooms. Students argued both sides with passion, unencumbered by lived experience. The case became theoretical, abstracted, its emotional core thinned by repetition. Yet for those who had lived through it, abstraction felt almost obscene. Late-night radio shows still took calls about it. Listeners speculated, connected dots, offered theories decades too late to matter. The host would eventually cut them off, reminding everyone that a verdict had been reached. The reminder never fully silenced the conversation. It only shifted its tone. The apartment complex, now unrecognizable, stood as a quiet contradiction. Life continued there without interruption. Laughter drifted through hallways once associated with fear. Children played in courtyards where investigators had once stood in silence. The past did not intrude unless invited. And yet, something persisted beneath all of it, a shared understanding that the story was not neat, that it resisted the comfort of clean endings. The cold case had been closed by the system, but it remained open in the human sense, in memory, in doubt, in the small hesitations that surfaced whenever someone claimed certainty too confidently. Florida nights continued to carry sound unpredictably. A door slammed, a voice raised. A television turned up too loud. People paused for a moment now, longer than they used to, before dismissing what they heard. The echo of 1981 had taught them that some sounds matter, even when they don't demand attention immediately. The case had ended officially, but its presence endured as a quiet pressure, shaping how people listened, how they remembered, how they understood the cost of waiting for answers. It was no longer just a story about a crime. It was a story about time itself, and how nothing, not even a verdict, can fully undo what time has already done. As the decades stretched further from the night itself, the case entered a phase that few people talk about, the long echo after interest fades, when a story exists mostly in fragments, resurfacing only when something brushes against it by accident. It appeared in casual conversations between investigators who never touched the file, in the way they lowered their voices instinctively when mentioning it, as if volume alone could disturb what had already been settled too forcefully. The victim's name was now etched into records more than memories, preserved in databases and citations, less often spoken aloud by people who had known her when she was still alive. Photographs aged in a way people do not, becoming artifacts rather than reminders, their edges scanned and resaved until the original prints no longer mattered. With each reproduction, the distance grew. The family noticed the shift first. Fewer calls from reporters. Fewer emails from producers. The world's appetite for the story had been satisfied, or at least distracted. What remained was the quiet responsibility of carrying it forward alone, without the strange comfort of shared attention. They were no longer representatives of a case. They were just people again, expected to function as if the past had not reorganized their entire lives. Some of them resisted that expectation. They spoke publicly when invited, careful with their words, aware that certainty could provoke anger from those who doubted the verdict. Others withdrew completely, choosing privacy over persuasion, deciding that belief was no longer something they needed to win. The case had taken enough. In law enforcement circles, the file was occasionally reopened, not for investigation but for review. Training exercises. Hypotheticals. What if this had been noticed sooner? What if this lead hadn't been dismissed? What if fear hadn't shaped behavior so quietly, so effectively? The case became a mirror for institutional self-examination, uncomfortable but necessary. New technology emerged, more precise, more invasive, promising answers to questions no one thought to ask before. There were moments when people wondered whether it might reveal something else, something overlooked even now. But without new evidence, technology had nothing to interrogate. Progress, it turned out, still required substance. The convicted man's health declined steadily. Transfers to medical facilities. Delays. Paperwork. The possibility of death before final appeal decisions loomed, threatening to cut off even the illusion of resolution. For some, that felt like an injustice. For others, an inevitability. For the family, it was simply another variable beyond their control. When news came of his death, it landed without ceremony. A short notice. A confirmation. No dramatic announcement. No final confession. Just an ending that felt administrative, insufficient, anticlimactic. The appeals dissolved automatically. The case, legally speaking, was complete. Public reaction was muted. There was no renewed surge of attention, no collective reckoning. Some expressed relief. Others expressed renewed doubt. Many said nothing at all. Death had closed one door, but opened no others. The questions remained exactly where they had been. The family processed the news privately. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of balance restored. If anything, it sharpened the realization that whatever truth existed beyond the verdict would never be spoken now. Whatever happened in that apartment belonged fully to the past, sealed by time and mortality. In the absence of a living antagonist, the case transformed again. It became less about guilt and more about loss. Less about justice and more about consequence. The focus drifted back to the woman herself, to who she had been before she became evidence, before her life was reduced to timelines and arguments. Some communities held small, informal memorials. No official markers. Just gatherings, brief and understated, acknowledging that something had been taken and never returned. It wasn't closure. It was recognition. The apartment complex stood unchanged, indifferent to the shifting meaning assigned to it over the years. Walls absorbed new sounds. New lives passed through. The space no longer carried the charge it once did, except for those who knew exactly where to stand and what to remember. At night, Florida still hummed with movement and noise, a state that never truly sleeps. The same conditions that once blurred the truth remained, heat and proximity and assumption. The case served as a quiet warning, not loudly repeated, but understood by those who had listened long enough. Time continued forward, as it always does, indifferent to verdicts and beliefs. The cold case that had once dominated everything now existed as a residue, a thin layer left behind after attention evaporated. It did not demand answers anymore. It simply existed, a reminder that some truths are not resolved, only endured. With the man gone, the case entered its quietest chapter, the one no one prepares for, when there is no longer a living figure to argue over, no appeals to track, no face to attach anger or doubt to. The story lost its antagonist, and in doing so, revealed how much of the tension had always been carried by the unanswered space itself, not the person who briefly occupied it. Records were archived again, this time with finality. Boxes labeled and sealed. Digital files locked behind permissions few would ever request. The system moved on efficiently, as systems do, marking the matter resolved, resources freed, attention redirected elsewhere. On paper, the Florida 1981 cold case had ended cleanly, its long arc bent toward conclusion. But in human terms, the ending was diffuse, scattered across people who had absorbed the story into their own lives. Former investigators felt a strange hollowness, a sense that something had slipped through their hands at the last moment. They had wanted a definitive moment, a statement, a look, something that would confirm they had been right to reopen old wounds. Instead, they were left with silence, heavier now because it could no longer be interrupted. The family noticed how conversations changed. People spoke more gently, more cautiously, as if unsure whether condolences still applied. Friends hesitated before mentioning the case at all, worried they might reopen something that was supposed to be closed. The family learned to navigate this new terrain, where grief no longer had a clear social script. They sorted through old belongings again, this time with no expectation of discovery. Letters, photos, objects kept for decades because discarding them felt like betrayal. Each item carried weight disproportionate to its size, evidence not of a crime, but of a life interrupted. In these moments, the legal outcome felt distant, almost irrelevant. The broader public memory continued to thin. Search results still returned headlines, but fewer people clicked. Algorithms moved on. New mysteries replaced old ones. The case slipped deeper into the archive of collective attention, joining countless other stories once considered unforgettable. Occasionally, a journalist would revisit it, framing it as a lesson, a cautionary tale about patience, about science, about the cost of delay. These pieces were polished, restrained, careful not to reopen debate too aggressively. They spoke of closure in careful quotation marks. Readers nodded, shared briefly, then scrolled past. In academic settings, the case took on a strange clarity it never had in real life. Charts replaced emotions. Timelines replaced memories. Students argued hypothetical outcomes, confident in ways only distance allows. For them, the uncertainty was intellectual, not personal. The messiness had been smoothed out by time. Meanwhile, the physical world carried on, stubbornly indifferent. Hurricanes came and went. Streets flooded and dried. Buildings were replaced. The Florida landscape absorbed, changed the way it always had, without ceremony. Somewhere beneath layers of development, the geography of 1981 still existed, unmarked, unnoticed. Those who had lived through the original disappearance sometimes caught themselves pausing mid-thought, wondering what they might have done differently even now. The instinct to revise the past does not disappear with resolution. It becomes quieter, more internal, but no less persistent. The idea of truth shifted subtly. It was no longer something to be proven or defended, but something to be carried, imperfectly. People accepted that the full story might never be known, that certainty had been approximated, not achieved. This acceptance was not peaceful, but it was functional. At times, the case resurfaced unexpectedly. A conversation overheard, a reference in a book, a familiar phrase like cold case uttered in a different context. Each instance brought a brief tightening of the chest for those who recognized it, a reminder that the past does not stay in the past simply because it has been filed away. The victim's name was spoken less often now, but when it was, it carried a different tone, less urgency, more reverence. She was no longer the center of an investigation, but the anchor of a memory. Her story had stopped expanding and started settling, like sediment at the bottom of water. In the absence of new developments, people filled the gaps with meaning rather than facts. The case became about endurance, about what remains after answers stop coming, about how communities absorb trauma and then slowly learn to live around it. The Florida nights continued their steady rhythm, cicadas and traffic and distant televisions blending into a familiar noise. The sound that once sparked fear was no longer distinct, but its lesson lingered. Pay attention. Write things down. Don't assume tomorrow will fix what today ignores. The cold case, once defined by its mystery, was now defined by its residue, the faint but persistent impression it left on everyone who had touched it. It did not demand belief anymore. It simply asked to be remembered, not as a puzzle solved or unsolved, but as a moment when time, chance, and human limitation collided and left something behind that could never be fully explained. By the time the case reached its 40th year in public memory, it had become something almost abstract, less a story than a reference point, a quiet marker people return to when trying to explain why some questions never leave you alone. The urgency that once defined it was gone, replaced by a subdued awareness, like an old scar you only feel when the weather changes. Those closest to it noticed how language shifted. People stopped saying, "What happened?" and started saying, "What remains?" The difference was subtle but important. The search for answers had given way to an accounting of consequences. The case no longer moved forward. It settled. The family spoke less about justice and more about time, about how it stretches grief into something unrecognizable, how it teaches you to function without healing. They had learned that resolution is not the same as peace, that a verdict can end a process without ending a feeling. Their lives continued, shaped quietly by a loss that no longer demanded attention but never released its grip. Some of them returned to places they had avoided for decades. The old neighborhood, the stretch of road she used to drive, the grocery store that had been renovated so many times it barely resembled itself. Standing there, they felt no revelation, no surge of clarity, only a muted acknowledgement that life had moved on without asking permission. In law enforcement, the case began to be cited less as an example of triumph and more as a caution. Not about failure, exactly, but about fragility. How much depends on the smallest decisions. How easily a name misspelled, a lead dismissed, a sound ignored can ripple outward for generations. The lesson was not that justice always arrives, but that it is always vulnerable. Cold case units expanded across the state, armed with better tools, better funding, better awareness. Younger investigators approached old files with reverence and restraint, aware now of how their work might be judged decades later. The Florida 1981 case hovered in the background of these efforts, an unspoken reminder of both possibility and limitation. The broader culture absorbed the story and reshaped it. It became part of a genre, one more example in a long list of delayed reckonings. People consumed it alongside others, comparing outcomes, debating fairness, ranking credibility. In that process, something essential was lost, the specificity of a single life, reduced again to a narrative arc. Yet occasionally, something pierced through the abstraction. A photograph viewed too closely. A sentence in a transcript read aloud. A mundane detail that resisted becoming symbolic. In those moments, the case regained weight, reminding anyone paying attention that it had never been about theories or systems, but about a woman who had trusted the ordinary flow of her day. The absence of a grave remained a quiet ache. No place to stand and say, "This is where it ends." Memorials remained symbolic, improvised, temporary. Flowers placed and removed. Names spoken into open air. The lack of physical finality kept the loss slightly out of focus, unresolved in a way no paperwork could correct. As years continued to stack themselves onto the past, people who had once been central to the story began to disappear themselves. Detectives retired, then died. Witnesses faded into memory. Even the family elders who had carried the earliest grief were gone. The case outlived many of the people who had fought hardest to define it. What remained was a thinner, quieter version of the story, passed down rather than experienced, understood intellectually rather than emotionally. And yet, its influence persisted in subtle ways, in how people spoke about safety, about attention, about the cost of assuming nothing will happen because nothing usually does. Florida continued to offer no answers. Heat rose and fell. Storms came and passed. New developments erased old landmarks. The physical world showed no sign that it remembered anything unusual about 1981. Only people remembered, and even that memory grew selective with time. The cold case no longer felt cold. It felt old. Old in the way unresolved things eventually do, no longer sharp, but heavy, settled deep enough to shape everything built on top of them. It had ended legally, culturally, procedurally. But emotionally, it existed in a different register altogether. And in that space between ending and endurance, the case continued to whisper its final lesson, that time does not heal what it does not touch, that answers do not always arrive in forms that satisfy, and that some stories, once opened, are not meant to be closed, only carried forward quietly, into whatever comes next. In the end, what survived was not the verdict, not the filings, not the arguments that once felt so urgent they consumed entire lives, but a quieter truth that settled only after everything else had fallen away. The Florida 1981 cold case did not end with a revelation that snapped the world back into place. It ended the way most things touched by time do, slowly, unevenly, without permission. The story no longer belonged to the courts or the headlines. It lived in pauses, in the way certain dates still caused a momentary hitch in breath, in the way some people never quite stopped listening at night. It lived in habits shaped unconsciously, doors locked twice, names written carefully, memories questioned before being trusted. The case had become a reflex. Those who remained closest to it stopped trying to explain it to others. They understood now that understanding could not be transferred cleanly, that anyone who hadn't lived inside the waiting would only ever see an outline. The details that mattered most were not the ones that survived retelling anyway. They were internal, wordless, resistant to summary. The victim's presence endured in subtle ways. In the choices people made. In the caution that surfaced without warning. In the lingering sense that something ordinary can fracture without spectacle. She was no longer a headline or a case number. She was an absence that had learned how to coexist with time. Florida itself offered no commentary. The place where everything had happened did not acknowledge its role. Sunlight still fell the same way. The air still pressed close to the skin. Sound still traveled unpredictably through walls and across open spaces. The conditions that had once allowed doubt to thrive remained unchanged, indifferent to outcome. The cold case label, once so heavy with implication, lost its urgency. Cold no longer meant waiting for answers. It meant acceptance of their limits. It meant recognizing that some truths emerge only partially, shaped as much by what is lost as by what is found. No final document closed the emotional ledger. No sentence marked the moment when grief officially expired. Instead, there was continuation. Life layered itself on top of the past, not erasing it, not resolving it, but carrying it forward in altered form. And so the story settled into its final state, not solved in the way people imagine, not unresolved in the way fear once demanded, but something in between, a reminder rather than a warning, a presence rather than a question. Somewhere, a sound would still be dismissed as nothing. Somewhere else, someone would pause and listen longer than they used to. That difference, small and immeasurable, was part of what remained. The Florida 1981 cold case ended on paper. In memory, it never did. It simply became quieter, folding itself into the background of everything that followed, a low, persistent echo reminding anyone willing to hear it that time does not erase moments, it only changes how they are carried, and that some nights, no matter how far away they seem, are never entirely over. What followed after everything had supposedly ended was not silence, but a softer, more deceptive version of it, the kind that convinces people nothing is happening anymore when, in fact, the consequences are still rearranging themselves quietly beneath the surface. The case no longer announced its presence, it seeped into the background, shaping reactions, instincts, and decisions in ways no one could fully trace back to their source. For some, the story became personal years after the fact. Young investigators, journalists, students, people with no direct connection, stumbled onto the case late at night, scrolling through archives, watching old footage, feeling an unexpected pull they couldn't immediately explain. They recognized something familiar in it, not the specifics, but the structure, the idea that certainty is fragile and that time is not neutral. The case spoke to them not as history, but as a warning delivered too calmly to ignore. The family noticed this quiet transfer. New faces reached out, not asking for interviews, not seeking commentary, just wanting to say they had read about her, that they had thought about her, that she had mattered to them for a moment. These messages carried no answers, but they carried acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, however delayed, has its own weight. In private, the family talked less about the crime and more about who she had been before it, small details once considered irrelevant now feeling essential. The way she laughed when caught off guard. The way she left cabinets open without noticing. The plans she never wrote down because she assumed there would be time. These fragments felt truer than any reconstruction offered in court. The system, meanwhile, archived its lessons and moved forward. Procedures improved. Databases expanded. Cold case units refined their methods. Progress was real, measurable, reassuring. And yet, the Florida 1981 case remained a quiet outlier, a reminder that even with better tools, some moments resist complete capture. That not every truth can be retrieved intact. Occasionally, someone would ask the question everyone eventually asks, did they really get the right person? The question no longer carried accusation. It carried fatigue. It was less about doubt and more about the human need for coherence. The answer, when it came at all, was usually careful, qualified, honest in its uncertainty. Probably, as close as possible. Enough. That answer lingered, imperfect but functional, the way many truths do. The place itself continued to forget. New construction erased older footprints. Streets were renamed. Trees were cut down and replanted. Nothing marked where attention had once converged so intensely. The absence of markers felt appropriate, somehow. The story had never been about a single location. It had been about moments missed, about attention diverted, about how easily ordinary life absorbs the extraordinary and keeps moving. At night, when the state slowed just enough to feel its own breath, the old instincts sometimes surfaced. A pause before sleep. A second look at a locked door. A thought dismissed and then reconsidered. These habits were not fear. They were residue. Proof that something had been learned, even if it could not be articulated cleanly. The case no longer demanded belief. It invited reflection. On what it means to wait. On what it costs to look away. On how long a single night can stretch when it is never fully understood. In the end, there was no final frame, no concluding image that summed everything up. Just continuity. Life after attention. Memory after resolution. A story that stopped being told loudly and started being carried quietly. The Florida 1981 cold case did not disappear. It thinned, spread out, became part of the atmosphere, invisible unless you knew how to sense it. And for those who did, it served as a final, enduring reminder that some stories do not conclude with answers, but with awareness, and that awareness, once gained, never truly fades. Eventually, even the echoes learned how to soften, not because they lost meaning, but because they became familiar, folded into the background of everyday awareness the way distant thunder becomes part of the sky. The case no longer interrupted lives. It accompanied them, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. People who had once followed every development now struggled to recall exact details. Dates blurred, names softened. What stayed sharp was not the sequence of events, but the feeling the story left behind, the unease that certainty is often retrospective, that clarity usually arrives long after it can do any good. The Florida 1981 cold case had taught that lesson too well to be forgotten entirely. In classrooms and training rooms, it was still mentioned, though more briefly now, less as a narrative and more as a principle. Preserve evidence. Question assumptions. Respect time, but never trust it. The instructors moved on quickly, aware that too much emphasis risked turning tragedy into abstraction. Students nodded, took notes, and carried forward a diluted version of the weight others had lived with. The family aged into a quieter resilience. Loss no longer defined every conversation, but it shaped the silences between them. They no longer searched for meaning in outcomes. Meaning had proven unreliable. Instead, they focused on continuity, on keeping her name alive in ways that didn't require explanation, spoken naturally, without preface or apology. They learned that remembrance does not have to be loud to be real. Every so often, someone uncovered the story for the first time and reacted with shock, the way people always do when encountering delayed violence, surprised not just by the crime, but by how long it had taken to face it. These reactions were brief, intense, and fleeting. The world absorbed them and moved on again. The case did not need fresh outrage. It had already consumed enough. The question of truth settled into its final form, no longer framed as right or wrong, but as reached or unreachable. People accepted that the story they had was the closest approximation they would ever get. Not perfect, not complete, but sufficient to explain the shape of what followed. Florida remained unchanged in the ways that mattered least and most. Heat pressed down. Sound traveled oddly. People lived close to one another, without always knowing who they were letting in. The conditions that had once allowed the case to exist had never disappeared. They had simply been normalized. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling legacy. The cold case had ended in records and rulings, but its deeper influence continued in small, untraceable ways, in instincts passed down without attribution, in caution mistaken for intuition, in the quiet understanding that not everything broken announces itself loudly. There was no final moral offered, no closing line delivered with certainty, just the steady realization that some stories don't conclude, they dissolve, spreading outward until they are no longer identifiable as stories at all, only as part of how people see the world. The Florida 1981 cold case did not fade into nothing. It faded into everything around it, into the spaces between sounds, into the pause before dismissal, into the moment when someone chooses to pay attention just a little longer than they otherwise would have. And in that lingering awareness, thin but enduring, the case found its last form, not as an answer, not as a warning, but as a presence that refused to vanish completely, reminding anyone willing to notice that time may move on, but it never truly takes everything with it. What came after that was not a chapter anyone marked, because by then the story had slipped beyond structure, beyond numbered parts and clear progression, into something more diffuse, a kind of background knowledge that shaped perception without demanding attention. The case no longer felt like an event that had happened. It felt like a condition. People who had never heard the details still carried its imprint indirectly. They inherited behaviors shaped by it, caution passed down without explanation, a tendency to pause before dismissing something small, reluctance to assume that silence means safety. These habits did not announce their origin. They simply existed, quiet descendants of a night most people no longer remembered clearly. The family reached a point where speaking about her no longer required preparation. Her name surfaced naturally in conversation, unaccompanied by explanation or tension. She became present again in a way the case had never allowed, not as a victim, not as a symbol, but as a person whose absence had shaped a generation of choices. This, more than any verdict, felt like reclamation. The institutions that had once surrounded the case moved on entirely. New protocols replaced old ones. Databases expanded beyond anything imagined in 1981. Investigators trusted tools their predecessors never had. And yet, Beneath that progress sat an unspoken understanding that no system is immune to blind spots, that time can still conspire with inattention, that certainty remains fragile no matter how advanced the methods become. Occasionally, someone would stumble onto the case late, reading it backward through summaries and analyses, and feel an unexpected weight settle in. Not outrage, not fear, recognition. The sense that this story, stripped of its specifics, describes something universal, the way ordinary days can fracture quietly, the way consequences can outlive their causes. The physical world continued its erasure. Renovations replaced renovations. The last people who remembered the complex as it had been in 1981 were gone. What remained was a location without memory, a place that held no visible trace of what had once drawn so much attention. The absence of markers was complete. And yet, absence itself became the marker. The cold case no longer functioned as a warning about crime. It functioned as a meditation on attention, on the cost of overlooking what seems unremarkable, on how easily familiarity can disarm instinct. These were not lessons written anywhere official. They lived in behavior, not policy. Late at night, when the world narrowed and sound carried farther than it should, people sometimes thought of the story without realizing why. A door closing too softly, a voice cutting off too suddenly, a moment that lingered just long enough to feel wrong. Most of the time, nothing followed. Life continued, but the pause itself mattered. The case had reached a strange kind of permanence, not fixed in detail, but stable in effect. It no longer demanded resolution. It had settled into the role of reminder, quiet and persistent, asking nothing except awareness. In that way, the Florida 1981 cold case achieved its final state. Not solved, not unsolved, not alive, not dead, but absorbed, diffused into the collective sense of how fragile normalcy can be, how long a single night can stretch, and how some stories, once released into the world, do not end so much as they disperse, leaving traces everywhere, even where no one thinks to look. By the time the story reached this far from its origin, it no longer announced itself as a story at all. It existed the way weather exists, present without introduction, shaping behavior without demanding explanation. The Florida 1981 cold case had passed fully into that state, no longer something people followed, but something they carried, often without realizing it. Those who encountered it late sometimes struggled to understand why it lingered so stubbornly. On the surface, it had all the elements of conclusion, an identified killer, a conviction, a timeline that could be explained cleanly enough. But beneath that structure was a hollowness that resisted being filled, the sense that something essential had slipped through the cracks long before anyone thought to measure them. The people who felt this most acutely were not always the ones closest to the crime. Sometimes it was an investigator reviewing an unrelated file who paused longer than necessary over a minor inconsistency. Sometimes it was a neighbor hearing a sound and choosing, for once, not to dismiss it. Sometimes it was a stranger reading about the case at an odd hour, feeling an unexpected tightening in the chest, unable to articulate why. The family rarely spoke publicly anymore. When they did, it wasn't to argue facts or defend conclusions. It was to remind people that a life had existed before it became a question. They spoke of ordinary things, preferences, habits, jokes that never made it into testimony. In doing so, they quietly resisted the way time tries to reduce people to outcomes. They understood now that remembrance was not about resolution. It was about balance, about allowing the past to exist without letting it consume the present. This understanding had not come easily. It had been earned through years of waiting, hoping, bracing, and finally accepting that some gaps would remain forever unfilled. Institutions rarely reflected on the case anymore, but its influence remained embedded in procedure. A checklist expanded here, a protocol tightened there, a reminder passed from one generation of officers to the next without attribution. The case had become invisible infrastructure, shaping responses long after its name stopped being spoken. Florida continued its steady rhythm, indifferent and unburdened. Heat rose. Storms gathered and broke. People came and went. The landscape showed no sign that it remembered anything unusual about 1981, and perhaps that was the final truth. Places do not remember. People do. And even people remember selectively. What survived was not certainty but sensitivity. A collective awareness, thin but persistent, that ordinary moments can fracture quietly, that familiarity can be deceptive, that time does not correct what is ignored. These were not dramatic lessons. They did not announce themselves. They simply altered the way some people moved through the world. The cold case no longer waited for anything. No answers. No justice. No validation. It had exhausted those demands long ago. What remained was a kind of stillness, not peace, but equilibrium, the point at which a story stops pulling forward and starts settling downward, into memory, into habit, into instinct. And so the Florida 1981 cold case reached its farthest edge, not marked by closure, not sealed by certainty, but diffused completely into the lives it had touched and the ones it never would. A story that began with a sound no one could agree on ended without a sound at all, just a quiet understanding that some nights never truly end. They simply become part of how the world listens afterward. Long after the story stopped being retold, after it thinned into reference and then into habit, there remained a final, almost imperceptible shift, the moment when the case stopped belonging even to memory and began to exist as instinct. Not remembered, not recalled, but felt. People no longer thought of 1981 directly. They didn't picture the apartment or the headlines or the courtroom. Instead, they carried a subtle recalibration, a quiet adjustment in how they interpreted the world. Silence was no longer neutral. Familiarity was no longer automatically safe. Time was no longer trusted to correct what had been missed. This was the case's last transformation. It surfaced in the smallest decisions. A report written more carefully than necessary. A detail preserved even when it seemed trivial. A sound investigated instead of dismissed. These moments were not dramatic. They would never make news. But they were real, and they mattered more than any conclusion ever had. The family reached a stage where grief no longer surged or receded. It simply existed, integrated, no longer an interruption but a constant presence that no longer demanded energy to carry. They spoke of her less often now, not because she mattered less, but because she had finally been woven back into the fabric of their lives, no longer isolated by tragedy. They understood something few people ever articulate, that stories don't heal wounds, attention doesn't restore balance, and justice, even when achieved, does not rewind time. What heals, if anything does, is integration, the slow acceptance that the past will remain unfinished, and that life must still move forward anyway. The world, indifferent as ever, offered no acknowledgement. No markers appeared. No anniversaries were widely noted. The date passed quietly each year, unremarked by most, significant only to those who felt it without needing to check a calendar. In that quiet passing, the case finally released its grip on urgency. It no longer asked to be solved, debated, or understood. It asked only to be carried responsibly, without distortion, without spectacle, without forgetting. And perhaps that was the final legacy of the Florida 1981 cold case. Not the identification of a killer, not the verdict, not even the doubt that followed, but the way it altered attention itself, nudging it slightly toward care, toward patience, toward the understanding that some truths are fragile and require vigilance long before they become mysteries. There was no final image to hold on to, no closing sound, just continuity. Life continued, imperfect and unaware, shaped in invisible ways by a night it had long since stopped naming. And somewhere within that continuity, the case found its last resting place, not as a question waiting for an answer, but as a reminder embedded so deeply it no longer needed to speak at all. At some point beyond that, even the instinct began to fade into something quieter still, not absence, but absorption, the way salt dissolves into water and changes it permanently without ever being seen again. The Florida 1981 cold case no longer existed as a separate memory, or even a separate lesson. It had merged with everything else people knew about fragility, about chance, about how easily the ordinary can tilt into the irreversible. Those who came across traces of the case years later often did not realize what they were touching. A footnote in a policy manual, a line in a training slide, a brief mention in a lecture about evidence preservation. They absorbed it without context, without emotion, carrying forward its influence without its name. The story had become anonymous, and in that anonymity, strangely resilient. The family reached an age where the future shortened naturally, and with that came a gentler relationship to the past. They no longer measured time against the disappearance. They measured it against each other, against health, against moments still available. The case, once the axis around which everything had turned, became one thread among many, still strong but no longer pulling. When they spoke of her now, it was with an ease that would have seemed impossible decades earlier. Not because the loss had diminished, but because it no longer needed to be guarded. Her name did not summon collapse. It summoned presence. That, more than any legal resolution, felt like the truest form of endurance. Outside that circle, the world continued its quiet forgetting. New crimes generated new urgency. New cold cases were born with the same early optimism, the same belief that answers would come quickly this time. The Florida case lingered only as a ghost of experience, whispering to those willing to hear that optimism should always be paired with care. The landscape erased itself again and again. What little remained of the original geography was now unrecognizable, layered under decades of development and neglect. The physical world offered no anchor, no confirmation that anything extraordinary had ever happened there. Only the human record suggested otherwise, and even that grew thinner with each passing year. Eventually, the case stopped being cited altogether, not because it was irrelevant, but because it had finished teaching what it could. Its lessons no longer needed reinforcement. They had been absorbed into practice, into caution, into the small disciplines that rarely attract attention but quietly prevent harm. And so the story reached its true end, not marked by closure or certainty, but by disappearance of a different kind. Not the disappearance of truth, but the disappearance of need. The need to resolve. The need to argue. The need to name. What remained was an altered way of seeing, a subtle shift in how people listened, how they noticed, how they resisted the temptation to dismiss the inconvenient or the unclear. That shift could not be traced cleanly back to 1981, but it existed because of it. The Florida 1981 cold case did not conclude with a final answer or a final doubt. It concluded by dissolving completely into the present, indistinguishable from everything else that had shaped it. A story that no longer stood apart, no longer asked to be remembered, but lived on anyway, quietly embedded in the way the world moved forward, carrying with it the faint, enduring knowledge that some nights never announce their importance until long after they have passed.